Hello and welcome back to my studio. Today I want to show you how you can bring some vibrancy into your drawings. So I'm going to show you how I create this toucan, and I'm going to concentrate on the feathers, the beak and the eye. And we're going to be using these are Panpastels, and we're going to be putting some pastel pencils over the top. So I'll walk you through some of the tips and techniques that I like to use. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk you through how I drew this toucan, and I want to discuss the supplies that I'm using, so that if you're not familiar with either pastel pencils, pastel mat or Panpastels, by the end of this video you'll have a bit better idea of how they work. I'm using Panpastels for the background of the bird to establish the main shapes and to lay down the first layer. Using Panpastels saves quite a bit of time, as using just pastel pencils with their tiny surface area would obviously take very much longer. So I'm starting to lay down the colour, and the tool that I'm using for this is a soft tool, spelled S-O-F-F-T. These come in 5 different shapes, but I like the triangular one the best, and I use it more often than the others because it can get into tight corners with its pointed tip. I also use eyeshadow applicators, as they're small and they have a nice spongy tip. You can also use cotton tips. The real blending with Panpastels is done with layering. It's a much different technique than you're used to if you're used to using pastel sticks, which are much softer and can be smoothed in without tools. Panpastels won't move when they're on this pastel matte surface, so the way to blend them in is to just add thin layers over the top of each other. Panpastels are amazing. They are pastels, but in the form of little pans of compressed pigment. They're easy to work with because you can just pick up a little pigment with your tool and apply it directly to the surface. They're great for backgrounds as well as for the first layers. They're highly pigmented and really rich in colours. They work great to give super rich, vibrant hues, which is great for this toucan. Using Panpastels and pastel matte is a great combination because the pastel matte has a unique ability to grab pigment and hold on to it. Panpastels are very nice to work with because, unlike traditional pastels, there's very little dust. It makes working with pastels less messy but more controllable. They're easy to store, as the little containers have screw top lids that you can stack on top of each other, and they last a long time as you don't need to use very much. Sometimes when I've used pastel sticks and sanded paper, I can't help but feel that I'm grinding down my pastels to dust, so I feel this is much less wasteful, and I like the way you can blend lots of colours together, although I've used my Panpastels straight out of the jars for this particular exercise. So this first layer goes on fairly quickly and easily. Notice I'm avoiding the edges of the toucan, as I'll get to those with the pastel pencils later on. But for now, I just want to apply some coverage. Now that I have my first layer in, I'm ready to begin the toucan's eye using pastel pencils. With all the animals I draw, I always start with the eye. I feel you can connect with the animal better this way, and it's a fun and fast beginning to get excited about the rest of the drawing. I'm using Carbothello pastel pencils, but you can easily use any other pastel pencils and pretty much get the same result. The first part of the centre of the eye is just black. I don't use pure black very much, as it tends to dull down artwork and make it look a bit flat, but for the eyes I wanted the greatest contrast possible, and it's just a small area, so I'm going right in and using straight black. I use it elsewhere, but I lay down other colours on top. Next to the centre is a ring of purple, and then blue, then black again, and these are just rings. I've sketched out my design, so at this point I'm just following my design lines. You might notice that I don't have super sharp pencils, so you might be wondering why. I used to keep all my pencils super sharp all the time, but I came to the conclusion that the end result in my art wasn't better because I had sharper points in my pencils. No one's looking that closely at the artwork. Also, with pastel pencils, they can break more easily than, say, coloured pencils, so I'd rather keep a decent sized point and not be bothered constantly sharpening and also wasting pigment, so I can achieve the look that I want this way. Notice how white the pastel pencil lays down even when it's placed over much darker colours. I love that about pastels. I add in all the highlights and pay close attention to the reference. I prefer to use a laptop or a tablet when I'm looking at my reference. This way I can get a better resolution than I can from a printed format, and I also like to be able to zoom in and out whenever I want to. I'm adding in some texture to the outside of the eye using dots and kind of circular motions. These little details make all the difference to make an eye look believable. I pay more attention to the eye than any other part of the bird, as this part is the real focus of attention. The other parts are all important, but the viewer will look at this the most, so it's important to get all of your highlights in correctly. I used just 13 pencils for this toucan. I think it's important to not get too bogged down with too many colour choices. Using more colours won't get you a better result by just using more colours. In fact, you'll just get confused and end up with a less cohesive piece. So I recommend just about a dozen or so pencils for a small study, less of course if you have something less colourful. Pastel pencils can be mixed together on the surface in the same way as Panpastels. So even if you only have a limited range of pencils, you can still achieve the colour you want, and it's wonderful that you can place lights over darks and darks over lights. This is totally different from using coloured pencils. I love coloured pencils and I use them often, but they're not nearly as forgiving as pastels. The sheet I'm using to protect my hand is glassine. This comes with large sheets of pastel mat. If you don't have glassine, you can use parchment paper or a sheet protector or something transparent, as it's nice to be able to see your artwork underneath as you work. But don't use a paper towel right on top of your pastel work, as it will drag colour if you move it under the pressure of your hand. And one of the drawbacks of pastel mat is that it doesn't erase well. So you have to protect the areas, especially if you're not adding a background. To achieve the finer lines and appearance of feathers, I lift the pencil off the page towards the very end of my stroke, which is what I use to achieve the front feathers here right by the eye. Now if an area doesn't look quite right, I can go in and fix it. With pastels, you can learn as you go, yet you can still be creating something that will work out by the time you're finished. And I really like this non-final approach to working. It makes it less stressful knowing you can change parts of your drawing, and it also makes it very accessible for people at any level. You can also keep refining your work as you go, as well as just adjusting things. Working on the back of the toucan now, I add in some black and establish the edges. I'm just covering up the sketch marks now and blocking in the main shape. The next part of the bird is the beak. Toucans have such large and beautiful beaks. There's a band of yellow striping that occurs here, alongside lots of orange. By the way, the Claire Fontaine pastel mat I'm using is not the same as sanded paper. It's made up of cellulose fibres. It comes in various size pads, but I like to buy the largest sheets they have and just cut them down to size. This is the anthracite colour and the closest one they have to black. They have a wide variety of different colours, and even though this is a really dark colour, I'm not worried about losing any vibrancy, which can often be an issue using dark colours when you're using other mediums. So at this point the drawing's really starting to resemble a toucan, and we have most of the colours laid in. Toucans have a red area on their front, and it's a bit like a fringe. To achieve a soft look, I'm using a flicking motion, always going in the direction of the feathers, and I'm taking a really light approach and turning my pencil over to find the sharpest point. As I move around, I'm taking care to keep a smooth shape to the fringing. The toucan's beak is a really vibrant red, so I add some more pigment with the red pastel pencil to that. Notice how I hold my pencil way back from the tip so that I can get a light pressure while still completely covering the paper. Throughout the drawing I've used a light pressure, and that's really all you need, because this way you can add another layer on if you really need to. But if you press too hard, you'll use up all the tooth of the paper and then run out of available tooth to use later on. And all the tooth is it's just the peaks and valleys of the paper. For the beak, I'm just adding in some markings here, and this will give character to the toucan. But I'm still using limited colours. I've used the same red for the beak as I am for the markings. And by the way, you might wonder why on earth the toucan has such a large beak. It isn't to attract a mate, as previously was thought. It is actually a thermal radiator that allows the bird to conserve or release heat, just kind of like an elephant's ear. Now I'm looking at getting the final details in, and these are the really important areas that take some time, but I'm looking at finishing the drawing. I usually take extra time to make sure all my edges are cleaned up, that my values are correct, meaning that all of my contrasts work well, and I look to check that everything that should be blended in is fully blended in, and that the areas that require the most detail, like the eye and the beak, are all proportionally correct, so that the highlights all look good and the shine on the beak looks believable and things like that. And usually the final stages happen after I've walked away from my piece and not looked at it for a while. I'm asked about this a lot, but I don't use fixative in my drawings. I either frame my piece, or if not, I cover it with some protective sheets and I store it away flat. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel, hit the little notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video.